is going to be specifically focused on the graphic design with vectors class that I'm teaching, just because to combine the two would be a little bit too much information to take in.
So Sam, can we start from the beginning and what is a vector?
Exactly. That's exactly where we're going to go with this. So if you will bear with me here for 1 second, this is an image search result that really, really does a good job of explaining the difference between a raster and a vector. And it's going to sound a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to show you with some examples what it really means. So you can see raster versus vector. A raster is a fancy way of talking about an image that is made up of pixels. So like a photograph that you would take with a camera, or like scanned in photos, digital photos, right? Everyone's heard of pixels. It's a bunch of little tiny colored squares that form a rectangle, and the different colors of the squares create an image. It's really, really good for doing things like reproducing photographic images. That's part of why we use JPEGs. That's a raster format of image. It basically just means that it's stored in pixels in a grid. It's really useful, like I said, for reproducing photographic images, but you'll notice here on this example, they use text, and you can see that when you blow up a pixelated text, it becomes, or sorry, when you blow up a raster image, it becomes very pixelated, right? You see these jagged edges, whereas a vector is a actually completely different kind of image format. So if the vector, instead of saving your image as a bunch of tiny little colored squares in a grid, what it does is it saves them as a series of mathematical curves, okay, called vectors. So basically, instead of being made up of a bunch of squares that have to be reproduced at a different scale, right, when you blow something up, what happens here is that the curves, you can scale them infinitely because they're just numbers. It's a little bit weird and mathematical, but I hope that it'll make a little bit more sense when I start showing you some images.
So a vector file will never become pixelated?
Correct. That's correct. It's infinitely scalable. It can be super duper small, super, super huge, and technically it will present the same.
Now, this all makes sense when I send stuff to the printer or to a graphic designer doing web. They prefer vector files. And now
exactly. Why. Right? It's because, especially if you think about what I'm about to show you, when the scale that you want to make something really starts to make a difference with these kinds of things. Like I'm sure you may have all seen advertisements, you know, for like a lawyer or something, and the picture is blown up way too big on the side of a bus, and it just looks like his face is all distorted. You know, that's the case of having a low resolution image, meaning there's low number of pixels there available, and then expanding it, you know, there's nothing to do but to make the tiny squares bigger, and then it looks really bad. So what I was just going to show here is, give me one moment. Right, here is a beautiful drawing of a tree that I made in about 10 minutes in MS Paint. So this image is very clearly made up of pixels, right? If I zoom in just even a tiny amount, you can see, right, it's just a bunch of tiny little squares, right? It's a very low resolution image. Now you can imagine, I mean, at this size, it doesn't look so bad maybe, right? It clearly looks like a tree. Now, the thing is, this image is, let's just take a look here. Under properties, we can see that the size in inches is 12 inches by 6.75 inches. And the resolution here says 96 dots per inch, which is just like pixels per inch. So if we printed this thing out at 12 inches by 6.5 inches, you know, we have a pretty decent idea of what it would look like. It would probably look, you know, like this. That's about right. You know, pixelated, but still readable as an image. Now imagine you want to blow this up to billboard size, right? That's closer to 40 feet by 10 feet, right? So effectively 40 times bigger than this. You blow it up that big and suddenly, you know, it's just a mess of pixels, and there's, you know, you can't tell what's going on. It looks like a mess basically, right? So the idea is that if you're going to print something, especially if it wants to have clean lines or distinct edges, the way that text especially does, or like a large logo, you really want to have it be something that can infinitely scale without losing any of the, you know, veracity of the curve, right? So that's just to sort of explain the difference between rasters and vectors and why vectors are important, right? Especially, or that's why I'm teaching graphic design with vectors, is because you want to make logos, if you want to make posters, if you want to have text and images combined, you need to understand the raster side of things as well as understanding the vector, or sorry, you need to understand the vector side of things as well as understanding the pixel and raster side of things that comes more intuitively with, you know, taking pictures on the camera or dealing with images on a computer that you would typically be dealing with. Okay, is everybody with me so far? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to now step into the program that I'll be teaching with this class. It is a free and somewhat equivalent program to Adobe Illustrator. Obviously, Adobe Illustrator can do tons of other stuff, but I prefer to give people the free option. I think that in this case, it is similarly powerful to Illustrator. And for the purpose of learning about how to do vector design, the two are pretty much compatible.
This program?
So go ahead, yeah?
What's the name of this program?
Inkscape, Inkscape. So like...
And it's free to download off of...
Yeah, and it's available for... I don't know if it's available for tablets, but I do know that it's available for Mac and Windows, PCs, laptops, etc. Okay, so just to do a quick overview of the Inkscape layout here, the tools that we'll be using, and I'll be talking about, they're over here on the far left side. Hopefully you can see my mouse. Oops, I double clicked. So there is a variety of different things that this program can do. And we're going to be focusing on one specific one, which is the pen tool, this one right here. The idea of the pen tool is to create a line, right? That's obviously the idea for any drawing program. But the pen tool has a sort of really interesting curve making property that makes it, the most valuable tool in this whole program, I would say. Just to give you a quick example of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about curves and Bezier curves. I would like to just show you quickly this video. So give me one moment. Yeah. Okay, it's based on what's called a spline. So you can see here, this dude is demonstrating what an old-fashioned spline is. It comes from boat building, and it's a way to lay out a curve along a series of points. Right, you basically want to get from point A over here on a piece of wood to point B over there on the piece of wood, and you're using these weights to sort of hold the line and bend it into a position. Right, so it goes from a straight line to a curved line by the use of these weights and sort of like pulling on the line itself. Okay, so that's a metaphor that we're going to be coming back to a lot with the pen tool, especially when we come to talk about Bezier curves. Okay, back to Inkscape now. Okay, so in Inkscape, I have selected the pen tool, and you can see that my cursor now looks like a little pen. The simplest way to use the pen tool is to create a straight line. And you do that by indicating a starting point and an ending point. So you just click to start it. You'll see that the white square appears there. That's the end point. And there's a red line that follows my cursor around that shows where the line could go, right? So if I'm just going to make a horizontal line, I drag my mouse out, and I click a second time, and you'll see that it turns green. And now I have a red sort of extension of the line following my mouse around. Okay, so that means that I could either continue the line or end it. If I continue the line, I can draw something like a square, click back on the end. Not a perfect rectangle, but it's there. This is obviously somewhat useful. If you want to make a perfect square, there's easier ways to do that, but that's not the power of the pencil, right? We were talking about curves. So let's get rid of this for now. I'm going to use the black arrow tool here. You'll see that the bounding box sort of highlights around this, and I'm going to press the delete button on my keyboard to delete it. Okay, so curves. The way that the pen tool creates a curve is by using what's called a Bezier, which is just a fancy French word that I don't know what it means. I think it's someone's last name. But the idea is that if you hold down your mouse button as you drag with the pen, instead of getting that red line, you'll see that I have this sort of blue antenna looking thing. Okay, this is effectively a weight on my line. And the further away that I pull it from that starting square, basically the more curved the line will want to be. Okay, so I'm going to let go here for now so I can show you what I'm talking about. When I move my mouse away, you'll see that I have that red preview line showing where my curve could be going. But you'll see that no matter where I move the pen tool towards, right, that blue line, that sort of antenna, that weight is pulling my line towards it, right? The softer the curve, the closer I go towards the weight, the more gradual it is. The further away that I go, the more sort of severe that curve is. And you can combine them. Well, let's just start with just one. Okay, so I'm going to grab with my mouse button, I'm holding down, and I'm going to drag, and you can see that now I have sort of like a balanced bar of these little antennas sticking out. You can see how moving it around affects that curve and how that line pulls, right? It follows the weight of the antenna there, right? And as I can keep going, I can pull this in all kinds of crazy shapes. Oh, goodness. Pull it back to the beginning, right? Does everyone see that this is creating a curve, right? So let's go ahead and we'll talk about the sort of companion tool to the Bezier curve tool, which is the, or pen tool as I call it, the edit path by nodes. So basically each time I clicked, I created a node. It's just a fancy word for a point along one of these vector lines. And you'll see that I can actually go back in and I can see a record of how far I pulled and how I stretched these, and I'm actually able to edit it. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's go back to the drawing of the tree that I had before in MS Paint, right? I want to make a vector tree, something equivalent to this. Okay, let's say I even wanted to go ahead and just trace this tree so I could have an exact replica of my beautiful drawing. Obviously, this isn't quite how it worked most of the time. Typically, a graphic designer would just sketch a logo design and, you know, scan that in. But for today's purposes, I think hopefully that will be good enough. So let's go back to Inkscape and let's bring in that picture of a tree that I had. Oops. I'll go to my black arrow tool, click on the line, press delete to get rid of it. And I will import an image from, let's see, my desktop. Okay. Boom, here's my tree. So let's say I just like the tree. Maybe I'm doing like my artist website and I'm like, I would love to have this tree image on my website as sort of a logo, right? As I said before, if you want the logo on the site to look good when it's super tiny up in the corner of the browser window, and also when it's, you know, blown up to be a full page splash when people get to your website, you know, it's going to be pretty important that you have it be scalable, right? It's a great example of a time when you want to use a vector. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little close on this thing and grab our pen tool here. Now, the cool thing about the pen tool is we know that if we mess up, we can go back and edit it, which is actually something I'm going to be doing on purpose here just to make my life a little bit easier. So we're going to pick sort of an arbitrary point on the outline of this tree, and we're going to sort of draw out the shapes that make it up. So I'm going to start by clicking right here, right? I'm creating a short straight line, and now I'm going to drag, and you'll see it's pretty tiny. Let me zoom in here. Okay, does everyone see this? That curved green line, then the weights that I just dragged out, and then the red line following me towards the right of the screen. I'm going to click and drag again. Ooh, hopefully this is coming through. I realize this might be a little bit too pixelated for everyone to see what's going on, so let me zoom out some. I'll do a pretty rough approximation here. So I'm actually going to use mostly straight lines, even though I said it would be curves, because the editing process for curves is a little bit tougher. Oops. Okay, so I'm using some of these curves in the corners. I'm sort of dragging to create a continuous form or silhouette for this tree. Okay, we're pretty much there. Ta-da. Okay, now we have two separate objects that exist in our little Inkscape workspace. That's a tongue twister, Inkscape workspace. Okay, we have this pixelated version in the background, and then we have this very thin lined vector version in the foreground. Okay, so the cool thing about vectors now is that we can start to change the way they look and edit them, like I mentioned with this tool here. As you saw me do before, we can grab onto one of these points and start to edit sections of the line. Right, so I'm adjusting them, I'm pulling the weights in, trying to pull the weights in, sometimes you miss. Right, so there's like these little inconsistencies here that I would want to clean up by just dragging these weights a little bit closer towards each other. And in this case, what I could actually do is change this from being a, what's called a, here, back to the pen tool. Oops, it's not the pen tool. There it is. Right, so you have this selected, and you'll see this sort of unmentioned before, but now very important toolbar right above our workspace, where we have these four options here to create either a smooth line, a symmetric line, which is what we have currently, a rounded line, or a corner. Okay, and this is a good example of where we'd want a corner, because you see two curves that are intersecting at a sharp point here on my tree drawing. So I'm going to go ahead and select the corner option. And now you'll notice that this actually changed from being a horizontal square to a diamond, or 45-degree square. And now these can be moved separately from each other on this particular point. Okay, so now we're like, this looks fine. I mean, it's a cool black line. Now what? So when you create a line in Inkscape, you basically have a stroke and a fill, which are fancy ways of saying the outline and the inside color. And right now we currently have on the far right side our panel called the stroke and fill panel. Okay, you can see here we have fill and it's set to X, which means there's no paint filling in this shape. That's why we can still see the image of the tree behind it. Now, if I select this square here, immediately adjacent to the X, I fill in the inside of that shape. All right, you can see, oh my goodness, I definitely messed up something there. Right, now I can go in and edit my shape further. Obviously, I would probably want to create a, tree-ish color for this. Whoa. Let's make that a corner. So we can, pull that in there. Oops. Okay. Right, so the green of the tree is now set, and you can see how we go about and do the rest of the tree in more or less detail, since we're a little short on time here. Right, we can create, at least for the moment, a rough approximation of what our final logo design should be. And then at that point, we could go in with detail, refine it, create that perfect outline. We may decide not to color it and just have it be these stroked objects, or do something sort of like this. We can create our stroke paint, set it to something nice and green for the tree, and increase the stroke width. Oops. Let's get rid of the background too so you can see what we're working with. This actually maybe looks just as ugly as the other tree did, but I think it gets the point across that these lines now, if we zoom in, right, there's no pixelation. No matter how close we get, how zoomed into the line we are, right, it's completely smooth still. So, with a little bit more than 20 minutes, you can definitely turn this into something that could actually be quite beautiful. And it's what most people who have logos or very graphic images anywhere on their website or in print or on ads or even on TV, it's typically going to be in that vector format. And this is how you can actually create vectors for yourself instead of having to, find them online or ask someone what to do. I think that about wraps it up for my time.
I love the option that you can basically trace them, because I'm often inspired by something that I see, online, and I'm like, oh, how can I recreate that or draw it? And I'm stumbling around trying to, draw it digitally. But it's great that you can just take that, overlay it, and do the, trace it.
Yeah, it's very, very cool, and the program has so much depth to it. In only 20 minutes, it's kind of hard to create such a detailed image, but there is a lot that you can do, and a lot of really interesting ways you can sort of combine shapes and like carve these vector images to create lines that are more and more complex. It's very, very interesting.
Do illustrators often use vector files for like books, or not really?
It depends. I mean, you can see that there's a certain, I guess you could call it a style to the way vectors look, because they are mathematical curves, and there are ways to sort of fake it and recreate it and actually create, highly detailed, realistic looking vectors. It just takes, you can imagine if you were to scan in like an ink splot, you could trace with that pen tool every individual detail of the ink splot and have an ink splot that you could blow up to be super huge on a billboard and, have it look beautiful still with no pixelation or sharp edges or anything like that. But yeah, for the most part, illustrators are probably scanning their own artwork, but there is that style, like there are plenty of books that have that sort of thick outline, flat color style, and they probably are using vectors of some sort.
Super cool. Well, thank you. Yeah. I don't know if anyone has any questions, you could put it into the chat, or if you can't think of any right now, you can email them to me. I'm Allie Allie, ALY, @pacificartleague.org. And like I said, Sam is teaching 2 different classes. Hold on a second, look at my little thing. It's graphic design with vectors, and it's for teens, 12 to 17. and that's Tuesday from 4 to 6, so it's great after school, starting September 8th. And it's the first session is September 8th, and then another session October 20th. And basics of 3D modeling. What is that class about? Can you talk about that? Your 30-second spiel?
Yeah, so it's basically about learning this program called Blender, which is a 3D modeling program, which is used for a variety of things. You know, predominantly you would see it in like Pixar using CG animation, right? They have to create 3D models. That's what you would call the actual digital object that each of those things is made up of. But they're used in video games and virtual reality and all kinds of other applications like that, including in many cases computer-assisted design and modeling, which is sort of where my forte is. Creating things for 3D printing and CNC milling and laser cutting, basically. So sort of combining the digital fabrication, creating this sort of object in a 3D world with physical output, which is pretty sweet.
So cool. So there's two questions. One is,
Yes.
what would the resolution for a file like this be if we were?
It's an interesting question because the answer is infinity, because a vector file is just a series of mathematical curves. So what would happen typically is a printer would ask you for a vector file. So you would either send them a file that was a .svg or .ai or .eps. Typically, those are like the three most common. And that is just the kind of file that saves all that data as mathematical curves and can interpret the mathematical curves. And then they would print it out at, you know, whatever their printer capabilities are, right? They would do that part on their end because you can just print from a program like this. And then would you use Inkscape in your industry? Also, is there equivalent free software for Adobe Photoshop? I mean, my industry is typically education for kids, so absolutely. I would say in terms of graphic design projects that I've done, yeah, I have used Inkscape for graphic design projects. It lacks in some places compared to Illustrator, but I would say for the most part, you know, if you learned on Illustrator, there's no reason not to use this. You know, there's a few small details that you might be missing out on, but for the most part, I think it's, you know, generally equivalent. And there's a couple different versions of Photoshop that I know of, or similar Photoshop. GIMP is the most popular one.
What's that?
GIMP, G-I-M-P, graphics image, something. I can't remember the acronym. I don't find it to be equivalent to Photoshop, unfortunately, but it is useful for image editing and stuff, you know. And then I can't remember the name of the other one. There's actually just like a website that basically works as a like miniature Photoshop. I can't think of what it's called off the top of my head. So unfortunately, I don't think there's another Photoshop out there.
I know Photoshop is, you know, it's not inexpensive, but it's such a great tool.
Yeah.
So a question, so the quality and size of a printed image depends on the printer's limits.
To a degree, yeah. I mean, you know, if you have like your home Epson or whatever, that thing can probably print 300 DPI, and you know the size of it, it can only handle paper that's, you know, 8 by 12. That's the scale that is kind of designed for. You know, even if it's doing photo printing, it's still probably only printing 300 DPI. And 300 DPI dots per inch, 300 pixels per inch, that is industry standard for photography and everything else. So it's not like 300 DPI is anything to sniff at. But, you know, if you really want like super high quality museum reproduction print of something that was, you know, like 18 by 24, you know, they could probably do something pretty good at like, you know, the FedEx Kinko's by your house. But, you know, an actual printing company has things that can print up to like, you know, 1600 DPI, and they can get super dense, you know, very beautiful, clean looking images and stuff like that. So if you're going to be using a vector, chances are what you're doing is you're either going to be putting your vector image, you know, like let's say you create this cool logo and you really only need the logo in like, you know, the corner of your album artwork, right? It's mostly the face of someone, right? But you want to have like their band logo right here. You know, the logo would basically be, they would get the photo all finished in Photoshop or the equivalent product, you know, and it would be scaled to whatever the print size needs to be at that correct size, you know, whatever it is, 4.5 by 4.5 inches for the CD. And then they would take the raster, they would have the raster image and they would import the vector onto the raster image. And then they basically do what's called flattening the image, which means that they get a 300 DPI version, a 300 DPI rastered version of that logo. So basically they take away all the mathematic complexity of the vectors and they just replace it with like a dot by dot trace over of that same vector image. And that gets sent off to the printers.
So another question came in. It says,
oh yeah.
Can you read that?
Okay, so That's an interesting question. It doesn't necessarily have to be for outlines only. So I'm assuming what you're talking about is when you create lines that are crossed, the fill begins to behave strangely. Is that correct? Like, okay, so that's where you get into the Illustrator program has taken some things from pure mathematics. And the thing that they've taken from pure mathematics to do this sort of fill is an algorithm that tries to determine when a line is self-intersecting and creates a closed space. So what happens when you create a figure 8 shape is that the two sides of the 8 want to get filled in. So I can actually, if you'll give me a second, demo that back here. Right, so if you were to make sort of figure 8 shape here and then fill it, or you get this effect, which, you know, can be kind of disconcerting if you're drawing something like this. Oops, you like keep these lines going. I actually didn't even connect those two pieces there. You can see a shape like this as we fill it in. It has a sort of like weird effect there. So, you know, it depends. This, if you know that this is going to be an issue, you know, you can fix these things, quote unquote, fix them. But you can also create shapes in other ways. And you're right that the pen tool, it is primarily focused on creating outlines. That is its like best use. If you're going to be doing things more complicated, there are other ways to create those vector shapes. So you could do things with like Booleans and, you know, subtracting and adding shapes together. You can do things by creating a live trace of an image, which is sort of like the cheater's version of what I just demonstrated for you that I didn't want to show you guys and spoil the fun. But yes, if you're trying to draw like shapes and volumes, you do have to be extremely conscious of, if you're using the pen tool, creating a complete and entire silhouette first. And then you can go in and create small shapes. And then by layering those shapes, you can create what looks like holes. So, you know, oops, if I go back to here, if I were to take another pen tool shape in Inkscape, oops, pen tool shape, like this, and fill it with white. Right now, something looks like I have a hole, right? But all I did was create a second shape and put it inside the silhouette of the first shape. That's sort of the basic idea of how you would create those kinds of hollow volumes. Or not necessarily volumes, but hollow shapes using a thing that's just made for outlines, I should say.